Hello, and back again. It's me, your favorite professor. Today I'm going to be discussing your final of the seven theories, Black Marxism. Black Marxism, in terms of its influence on the discipline of Black studies, is probably one of the oldest. Today, you'll be you might be fortunate to be exposed to Black Marxism in your academic journeys, especially for those Black studies majors in specific classes. But at one point, it was one of the leading not only kind of analytical uh, tools, but it was within academic spaces, but also in terms of its influence on social movements, but more broadly in the 60s and 70s, probably no theory has had more, as, especially during that time, as much influence as Black Marxism in terms of its critique of Western civilization. Many of the theories that we've worked through were introduced to kind of this conceptual framing of existence or the concept of this question of ontology through Marxism. Marxism itself, as I explained before, explored the conditions of, or really a critique of the conditions of poor and working class people within capitalist societies. So for the Marxists, those belonging to the outgroup were and are the poor and working class people, with middle class serving as kind of like a buffer zone. The will in this regard, it's the will of the working class that will determine the outcome, the ultimate that is driving the outcome of either a a perpetuation of capitalism or its undoing. It's the working class really that hold that key. Early Marxists were set on this eventual capitalist or anti-capitalist revolution, or this poor and working class revolution. Even Dr. Martin Luther King, in one of his final works, The Poor People's Movement, some argue is when he started shifting the narrative around more of a kind of inclusive class critique that eventually led to him being murdered, by the government. With that being said, let's revisit my guiding quotes. We were introduced to the second quote in Sylvia Winter's article on the invention of man. And again, the idea of race would become the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years. Neely Fuller is probably somebody you won't be exposed to. He was probably, he is a radical in the non-traditional sense. Much of his work comes from his work outside of academia, although he has given presentations within colleges and universities. His work, he would be, he's doing this work really just out of his own will and volition, and not necessarily within the confines of academia. As somebody who was, committed to kind of understanding the 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 dynamics, the continued and persistent dynamics, Black people face in society. So again, he said in his book, The Compensatory Code Book, if you don't understand white supremacy and racism, everything that you do understand will only confuse you. Now, Neely Fuller's work did influence Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who was a psychiatrist who wrote the ISIS papers, which again is probably a work that you won't that you won't read in your gender and woman studies courses because Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, was an ardent critic of feminism, of kind of the way in which identity has been used to confuse society, but particularly Black people. Um, um, her, I would just say if you're interested, definitely look up her work. The ISIS papers was written in the 1980s, which was definitely set in a bit different time. But one of the things I appreciate about her and these scholars in the 1980s, one, this free debate that was taking place, even on talk shows like Donahue, and the talk show circuit was driven by debates between opposing groups or of ideologies, of ideas, theories about the world. So, but so even within the discipline of Black studies, there was debate about the future, about the direction, about what it is that is the central problem of Black people. So for Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and I would say even your Afrocentrists at the time, theirs was focused on Blackness. That it was this struggle was at the forefront of, or should be, or ought to be, thinking about this in terms of ethics and morals, at the forefront um, of of what we do and how we do it, in terms of liberation, or even thinking about liberation. And every other, struggle was secondary to that central struggle of race. Now, as we shift uh, in thinking about, Marxism, if you think about this, and Annabelle Keanu's quote, the idea of race, and you'll see this in the essay, um, in today's essay. Um, let's see, it pulls up here. My computer's going a little slow. It's the introduction to Black Marxism by Cedric. It's an introduction to his book on titled Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. Um, but you see, and you'll see, if you take Blackness out of the equation of Europe and its modernities, if you take Blackness out of the equation of whiteness, who represented or even represents the biggest threat to those in power? When I say those in power, those at the center of power within European and Western modernity. Who represented the biggest threat to their place and seat of power? Again, if you exclude Blackness or Black people and the perception of Black people in terms of its, thinking about it as Winters and Fanon tells us, in terms of its this superstition of Blackness and this always sense of, as Afro-pessimism, this sense that Blackness is a threat that needs to be disposed of. So if you eliminate Blackness as the threat, or Black men as a threat, as Dr. Tommy Curry referenced, who then represents the biggest threat to those at the center of power? It's poor and working class white people. So going back to this quote, again, thinking about this through the lens of class, why was race invented? To neutralize dissent amongst poor and working class white people. Confusion, to give them a sense of self, a status, a psychological um, uh, like sense of esteem, of belonging that was in direct conflict to their social and economic status. So race. So in this regard, and you see this playing out today, poor and working class non-black people will substitute their have exchanged their economic status for their psychological status. This is what Fanon refers to as the libidinal economy. And Marxist Cedric Robinson, not in this in this work, but not in this particular essay, refers to talks about that the libidinal economy, the economy of the mind, of the emotions. So while I'm fighting to destroy, to burn down the White House a year ago or so, about a year and a half ago, not because I'm poor and experiencing class-based violence and subjugation. I'm burning down the White House because of a perceived threat to my sense of self, my whiteness. So, how, at the beginnings of this European modernity, was dissent neutralized? Through the invention of race. And now we could say it's probably become perfected. Our insistence on identity, on these social constructs, these inventions of our mind, beautiful things. It's this imagination that, in many regards, is why we were able to evolve as a species in the way that we did, distinct from other animals. But that imagination run amok is dangerous. So our Black Marxism is a critique of Marxist thought, Marxist ideology, and Marxist as a social movement and political movement, because in its interpretation of the conditions of poor working class people, it was, as Winter explained, it fell to the same generalized universal concept of existence as man two and man one did, meaning it interpreted the world through the eyes of the European. And it neglected the experiences of indigenous folks and African people or people of African descent. So even though Du Bois, uh, for example, and many others um, were at one point gravitated to Marxism, many were left kind of like a lot of Black folks even today as we try to organize or kind of join in different social movements, whether that be gender, sexual orientation, or whatever it might be. We become dissatisfied because of those groups' inability to really control for the experiences of those of the slave. Slave throws everything out the window. Poor working class white people at one point in US history were indentured servants. If you take the Black history courses, you'll see. I'm not teaching one this. I'm teaching the class at San Diego State this year, but you'll see the history in this transitionary period from indentured servitude, Black and white people. Although the Black people were already considered slaves and brought over here as slaves. But once they got here politically, they were indentured servants similar to white people or white people who came over here to the New World. And it was a class rebellion that eventually led to politically and legally the formation of slavery here in the United States, the Bacon's Rebellion. So race was used politically, socially, psychologically to control, yes, Black people, to subjugate them, as we're not talking about in terms of that inferiority complex, but really to subjugate those who thought or think they're free because of their status of non-Blackness from an Afro-pessimist perspective or whiteness, their status of as white. There's a case, and maybe I'll post it for extra credit. Here, the first incident of desegregation actually happened in Lemon Grove, San Diego, in the 1920s or 30s, I believe. And it was a group of actual Mexican, is a group of Mexican folks, immigrants, who fought to be integrated into Lemon Grove Elementary School. They were going to school with the white folks, and the white folks got upset at the growing population of Mexican people, and they're like, no, we need to segregate we'll build a school for the Mexicans. The Mexicans go to their school, and the white kids will stay in their schools. Does this sound familiar? And the Mexicans, fought and went to court and ultimately won. And the reason the judge sided with the Mexicans in this case was because he said they were basically white. They spoke English, they look white. For all intents and purposes, these are white children and should be able to go to the white schools, unlike Asians, Native Americans, and Black people. And there's a history of different groups fighting for the status of whiteness, because up until the 1950s and 60s, in order to own land and property, you had to be white. To reap the benefits, the economic benefits of capitalism. For much of our history, you had to be white. And again, central to this idea of capitalism is land ownership, the right of individuals to own property, where different programs and grants that supported others to be able to buy land and property, for much of our history, Black people were excluded from. Confusion. Race, the most efficient instrument of social domination. Today, with the invention of Man 2, we are clamoring to these ideas of these social constructs, and not only, relating to them as constructs, but these constructs have replaced reality. So now reality, what is real is the invention, is the construct, and not reality itself. So now we're not changing the construct, we're trying to change the physical reality to fit the construct. Again, with this invention of Man 2, this idea of biologically determined, that you can find race or any of these constructs biologically. And you can find any of these constructs in history. One note, I'm gonna is if you ever travel outside the United States, particularly to less developed nations, you see kind of a different orientation to you see how people make meaning of their lives different than they are here. Now, much of this, as Sylvia Winter, in terms of our kind of how we interpret reality, um, is based upon kind of our relationship with Mother Nature. So for those, for instance, so those societies that are more tethered to Mother Nature or intimately tethered to Mother Nature in a way, I'm still depending upon kind of this relationship with Mother Nature to sustain my life and my existence, not only for myself, my family, but my community. We see a different relationship where that battle between like life and death is you know, the questioning of whether I can even feed myself and my family, where the stakes are higher. We see people relating to these constructs differently. So on a recent trip, this is a picture in Ghana. I was in a bus and we were traveling. And again, we were a bunch of group of scholars coming from the West, looking at the dynamics and kind of the society, social life of Ghanaian people in this particular township. And somebody asked, okay, why are women doing all the labor? Because in terms of what's forward facing, you see mainly it's women on the street selling on the market, carrying kids on their backs. It's women doing most of the work. And I had to think for a second, and whether or not I wanted to engage in this conversation, but I just simply asked her to look beyond the women to be able to see what the men were doing. So while women were on the market, kind of selling produce, selling goods, and taking care of the kids, the men and boys, they were being trained to make boats. These boats would go out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. These man-made boats, fishing vessels. We see gender is not tied to this individual sense of self in this particular instance. Gender is tied to the collective good of community. So we see kind of how these constructs, we invent them and why we invent them, and a construct like gender and its biological or physical referent being kind of our physical bodies. I don't care what you say or what you say you do. Can you, in this instance, what's the most efficient use of your body? And it's you upholding that commitment or upholding that norm that keeps the community, that keeps things working and functioning and is necessary for the survival of our community. So me, if I decided I don't want to do this labor. I don't want to do this for whatever reason I create. That that I, that me in Africa, this question of who I am is answered through this idea, or I'm not going to say Africa, but there's an Ubuntu proverb that comes out of the Swahili tradition, or Swahili culture. It's this idea of Ubuntu. And basically, what that means is I am because we are. We are, therefore I am. So my sense of self is directly connected to my community. Where in our society is just the opposite. We don't, whatever sense of community have is secondary to myself for narcissism. But here, if I decided I don't want to hold up my end of the bargain, I want to do something else, it threatened the livelihood of this community. It's threatening their very existence. So when I asked one of our tour guides, you know, about some of these dynamics, and he said it was the West that was in terms of the change, you're seeing a shift in kind of cultural norms, expectations in this kind of community. And he said, what's threatening that shift is the West imposing its belief systems on their community, their ideologies, their answers to the question of who I am, of existence. So no longer is a community sense of me, myself, or togetherness or we-ness. It's you have the individual right to do whatever you want to do with your body. Well, that's all fine and dandy if these uh, NGOs and these Western organizations are going to finance this community. Okay, well, you let everybody do what they want to do, but that's okay because we're going to finance you all in terms of so you can be able to sustain yourself. But that's not the case. And many times they'll bring in they'll the way that they'll cause confusion, especially if there's resources tied to that land that they want. They'll sow this seed of discord, this seed of individualism. So this concept of gender, there's implications here in this again community for the men, the expectation of the physical labor, the labor that's going to threaten your life, going out there into the middle of the ocean to provide for your family. One of the beautiful things is I don't have a picture of it, is whenever the men would come in from their fishing excursions, the children would be up on the the bridge, and they'll be cheering the guys on as they come in. And then the boats with no fish, they'll be booing and making fun of. But again, the female body, the expectation of the female body as the giver of life, not going to put you in harm's way to threaten existence itself. Now, maybe there's going to be a time soon when we no longer need the female body to produce life. We're hell bent on being God. Whether that be the particle colliders to recreate a Big Bang, or whether that be even being able to produce life in labs. The West is hell bent on making that a reality. I'm not too keen on, I'm scared of that reality. But here, in this instance, we see, again, the womb is tied to existence itself. So we're going to create social constructs around expectation. We're going to create this thing of gender and the expectations of it to protect life. Or in this instance, we're going to create the ideal of what it means to be a man, this construct, again, to provide for the family, to provide for the community. In the West, all this is thrown up in the air today. We have in many ways conquered Mother Nature. We are insistent and persistent on this notion of self that's masked as, I'm living my best life. Last is I'm doing me, this sense of self and I-ness that centers everything. And I would argue that Fanon would argue we're basically all imitating whiteness or man-to in that regard. So the destiny, when we think about all people, is to perpetuate or re-perpetuate man-to. So while we're fighting for these notions of identity, or what Marxists would call this false consciousness, this psychological status, this psychological capital, the sense of I belong because I am. So that becomes our goal, getting representation. I'm gonna post a video under this that's gonna talk about this in the 1950s, and how we see kind of as Black people started progressing economically, experiencing economic mobility in ways that they hadn't before. We see that there was a a counterattack that was disguised as opening up spaces that to sell to black people that black people were once forbidden from. So some would argue, and many Marxists would argue, that even the ending of slavery, civil rights legislation, wasn't about ethics and morals or doing the right thing. No, it was about, in one hand, we're shifting to more consumer economy. That at different points, whether at the end of slavery, demanded it more consumers than it did laborers as the economy shifted to more industrial, from agrarian. Um, but now we're creating a consumer class where economy is dependent upon having consumers, consumption. And in the 1950s, this video was produced on how to get Black people to buy your products, representation. So today we're fighting for representation. In the end, we might get the psychological satisfaction of seeing a Black baby doll in Target or Pride paraphernalia in Walmart, the pink economy, one of the richest community, wealthiest communities uh, in the nation. Uh, but we get the psychological satisfaction of seeing an emotional sense. Oh, I got a doll I can buy my child. Well, Target and Walmart are making millions and billions of dollars off selling us goods we once made ourselves. So, so even those Black businesses that are you know, selling their products in Target and Walmart, talk to those business owners and see how difficult it is. How much of their dollar do they actually get when one of their products is purchased? But these are the things we're clamoring for: representation, representation. For Marxists, this is called false consciousness. For those who belong, who are part of modernity, some are invested on reproducing this confusion because they already, you can't assume somebody's class status based upon, their sexual orientation. There's literally based upon really, again, their gender, you know. So some are completely invested in creating confusion. Um, others, um, you know, consciously or unconsciously, again, are at the same time unaware, if Marxism is true, of the implications of how capitalism works is perpetuated in how we consent to our own subjugation as poor working class people, which is the highest aim. If I can get you to consent to my will, I can create a false sense of agency, a false sense of belonging, a false sense of, yes, I can too become the next this person. Name that person. Then ultimately, I control you and you don't even know it. Our class-based kind of analysis I do like because it it's more empirically based, meaning I can look up data statistics on who's wealthy, who's not. It's empirical. There's no question about it. That's one thing I do appreciate about kind of a capitalist, your capitalist critiques or anti-capitalist critiques. Um, Unlike many of the other theories, I think, which were much more grounded, kind of more interpretive kind of relationships, even though we're Black male studies, on the other hand, and it's taking from post-colonial analysis, it's also grounded in empiricism. Much of your Black male study scholars are show me receipts. You say Black men have privilege, show me where they have privilege. You say um, we make all these claims, and Black male studies is asking for evidence to support your claims. Whether that's be your assumptions about Black men having kind of this patriarchal advantage over others in society, or the way in which the struggles and the experiences of Black men are being conflated with other groups, and somehow we using the struggles, the not the deaths, the murders, Black men are being sacrificed not to promote the the, the the life of Black men, not to curb their deaths, but ultimately being used. So they're being, in many instances, being used to promote other people's agendas. And again, as we talk about, we saw that with the recent Black Lives Matter protests, or it became not about police brutality, which is overwhelmingly in terms of percentage wise, focuses targets on men, probably 90 to 95% of police, victims of homicide are males. But and then the disproportionate number of those men being Black men, Black and brown men. But in terms of sheer numbers, again, this is another example, and you can look this up. In terms of sheer numbers, white men outpace everybody in terms of police homicides, or victims of police homicide. So why don't you see white men? And again, if you think about who are the white men being murdered, it's your poor and working class white men. So why aren't they, rather than protesting and joining in the protest against police brutality, they're fighting to defend the police? Like I said, going back to the original quotes, until you understand white supremacy, racism, everything that you do understand will only confuse you. The idea of race will come to be the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years. How are we working against our own best interests? That's what Black Marxists are up to. So for this week, I posted your assignments under, uh, you have your here are the assignments, validation activity, your reading, your quiz, and your discussion. For the discussions, again, uh, please respond to at least 2 of your classmates' posts so you can get full credit for the discussions. And I will post a couple of extra credit opportunities here as well. All right. I wish you all well. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm going to also put the discussion board here in the module as well. I forgot to put it, the open forum. And if you have any questions, post them there. And again, I check those periodically. If I need to insert or respond, I will. Otherwise, again, seek help from your classmates. All right, take care.